and I've decided to show you how to make a very simple lock miter joint that is fast and easy using an ordinary 45-degree miter cutter, not a lock miter knife, but just a miter knife, to make beautiful veneer type furniture. First I want to show you what the joint looks like. Here it is. Now this joint is cut with a single cutter, which I'm going to show you how to do, and a little work on the table saw. And when you put it together, you only have to clamp in one direction, and the miter will not slip, and you'll get a perfect veneer line on the corners. Now the first thing we're going to do is start here at the table saw to make a gauge block that we'll need when we get to the shaper. So raise your saw blade up about 3/8 of an inch and about 1/4 of an inch from your fence, and just cut a kerf into a scrap piece of wood. Just like that. Alright, here at the shaper, let me show you the cutter that we're going to use. This is just a 45-degree angled cutter in which I had my sharpening guy grind a small relief on the top edge of the cutter. Now the benefit in using this technique is that with actual lock miter knife cutters, one piece of wood will be required to go through vertically, while the other piece of wood will be required to go through horizontally. In this technique, all the pieces go through the same way, horizontally. So let's put this on the shaper. You want to put it on with the point up so that the point of the wood, the miter, will be cut against the bottom of the fence. Now, as in all shaper operations, safety first, of course. Keep your fingers away from the cutter. Use a stock feeder if you have one, or you should at least use hold downs to keep the wood tight against the table. Well, several important things. One, you want both fences to be in alignment because the top edge of the joint is not going to be cut by the cutter, and it's going to be the line of reference that feeds your piece of wood through. You want to set it, remember the kerf block that we cut at the table saw. What you want to do is you want to set the height of the cutter to leave a piece of wood, which will be the tongue in the joint, that is the thickness of your saw blade. By taking the gauge block, you can drop it down over your piece to see that it is the proper thickness, and will go into the joint. Now, some plywood is not 100% uniform in thickness, and we can deal with that later. You want this not to be too tight. It should be a nice, easy slip joint, because when you go to put glue in it later, the wood is going to swell. And if it swells too much, you'll have a hard time getting the joint together. Set your cutter to leave that thickness of wood. Then what you want to do is you want to move your fence in and out against the cutter so that you are just touching the top edge of the veneer with the miter. It should be a point. It shouldn't have any flat on it, but you don't want to cut too far into it either. You'll know when you cut your samples, if you've done it correctly, because if you stand it up on edge, the piece of wood should stand perfectly square. It shouldn't be leaning into if you've cut too much off the miter. You want a fair amount of pressure on your stock feeder to keep the wood flat against the table, because that is your point of reference for this joint. You also want to feed your stock with your good face down against the table. You want to decide how you're going to clamp your piece together. Remember, when the joint is finished, you'll be clamping in one direction. So, for example, if you had two pieces that were going to be mitered together this way, you would want the tongue on both sides of this piece so that when you applied clamp pressure, you're only clamping in one direction. The next step is to convert the pieces that you've cut into the tongues and grooves. So the first thing you need to do is set your fence so that the outside of the saw blade is the exact thickness of your piece of wood, like so. And of course, cut some sample pieces before you actually cut your workpiece. So the first part what we're going to do is we're going to convert these pieces into these pieces. And you want to set your saw blade height so that your tongue will be about 3/8 of an inch in length. You don't want to cut too deep into the top because you'll lose some integrity in your joint. Miter up, you're going to cut this tongue off. And there we've created the tongue part of the joint. Now, before we cut the tongue, you'll see that exactly how much you're going to have to cut off. In this case, we have to cut about 1/4 of an inch off so that the joint will close. Again, with the miter against the fence, adjust your fence so that you're going to be cutting off that 1/4 inch. Adjust the height of your blade so that it does not touch the bottom of the miter. And there you have it, a perfect lock miter. Well, now that you have the joint cut, the next step, of course, is to glue it together. Now, just a couple of words about the way your joint fits together at this point. You want to have a little bit of space in the groove so that some of the glue can squeeze into that little space, because it creates an awful lot of hydraulic pressure when you go to clamp the joint together. And again, if your joint is too tight and you put glue on here and the wood begins to swell, you're going to have a very hard time getting this joint to close. So make sure that you have some clearance for glue. You put a little bit of glue on the back wall of the groove, and then put the glue on your miter. Smooth it out, make sure that you get the whole surface covered, and make sure that you absolutely cover all the way to the edge of that face veneer. On this piece with the tongue, apply the glue, brush it into the corner, now you'll see when you put the joint together, and you apply just a little bit of pressure, you'll get a nice little glue squeeze coming right off of the edge. That's when you know you've got just the right amount of glue in there. Of course, then you clamp it. And when you clamp these on big projects, such as the table I showed you in the beginning, you want to use strips of wood to make sure that you get an even distribution of your clamp pressure. And you want to keep the clamp pressure even with the top of that miter when it's clamped. This way, the clamp pressure won't cause your joint to open. It'll close it. Now, even though the joint is not dry at this point, I want to show you how you're going to finish this. The easiest way to get this joint to be perfect is, depending on the glue you're using, I usually leave it clamped anywhere from a half an hour to 45 minutes under clamp pressure. I then take the clamps off, and with a furniture scraper, I'll keep it flat on one surface and scrape the glue off, and then I'll scrape the other surface, keeping the scraper flat. Don't angle your scraper, because you'll be surprised how much wood a scraper can take off the veneer. After you do that and get all the glue off, if you just touch the edge of the joint with a little 220 sandpaper, you'll get a perfect mitered joint.